Okay, so before we get started, I just want to introduce who our panel members are today. Both are graduates of the Leadership Series. Josh Hirschberger graduated in 2010, as you can see from your bio information that you should have there with you. And then Steve Yeaton graduated in 2014, which actually was the first year that I kind of took over the series. So poor Steve, it was a guinea pig year. We didn't have quite as big a group as we have this year. Steve is the senior pastor at First Christian Church of Columbus. He was formerly at Batesville, which is actually, when he was at Batesville was when I got to know Steve through some mutual friends, and I've been privileged to come down to Columbus and preach in his church there, and I was able to do the same thing in Batesville. And so I asked him to come and be a part of this panel to provide kind of the practitioner side of this religious liberty debate, particularly against the backdrop of some of what we've seen in COVID. And then Josh has, and still is, an attorney. He is officially working with the Indiana Family Institute and also what's called the Daniel Initiative, and he may share a little bit about that. Is it fair to say you're a former pastor?
No, I'm still a teaching pastor.
Okay, so he's still a teaching pastor, lives down in Madison, Indiana, down in the southern part of the state. And so he brings a lot of the legal expertise, a lot of the cultural engagement perspective, and he has a study guide that he put together called Persuasion Points. I'm just about done with it, and covers, the different chapters cover some big ticket subjects that are really kind of right on the cutting edge of where we are as a culture. And so he has put some good work together there for individuals and groups to study. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about this, and I had a picture, we weren't able to show it, but I just want to kind of describe the scene, and maybe you have seen a picture like this on the internet. There's a picture of a house that is right up on Lake Michigan, and as you can see from the profile shot, about 1/3 of their foundation has eroded right into Lake Michigan. So you have a third of this house that is hanging off of, literally, a cliff. My question to you, and this is just kind of rhetorical for the sake of our discussion, and then I'll pass it off to Josh, is this. Does the government have an obligation to remove the residents of that house if they resist being removed in some way? Do they have any obligation, or does the government leave them alone, and if they want to drop into the water, that's on them? Okay? Now, theoretically, many of us would say, well, if they're resistant to the move, then yeah, for their own safety and security, we need to step in and get that situation resolved. The challenge has become, what if the building is not a house but a church, and the cliff is not a cliff, but it's a pandemic? And that's where there has been a lot of robust discussion about the implications of religious liberty philosophically, and then also what does the practical application of this fundamental philosophical idea of religious liberty look like in society, okay? So I'm just kind of teeing that up, and we're going to have Josh and Steve and myself get into a conversation about that. So Josh, go ahead and take us through, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Senator Crane. And so Josh Hirschberger, I am an attorney as well as a minister, and so sometimes people ask me I can serve God and the devil all at the same time. And I tell them normally it's just about 99% of attorneys that give the rest a bad name. So any of you attorneys out there, you're in the 1%, by the way. All right. So I wanted to talk today about religious liberty, and to give you a bit of a roadmap of what we're going to talk about today, I want to talk a little bit about what is it. And I'm finding that one of the most important questions in our time is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? And so what is it? I want to go back to Scripture. And I find in these really intense, difficult, complex issues, coming back to Scripture saying, as Christians, what should we think about a particular issue? So what is it? We want to then talk about where is it? And we're going to get into some of the details, just like parking lot, drive-in services, the shutdowns for churches, and also about the Bostock case, which came out last Monday. And then we're going to talk about, where do we go from here? What's next? As faithful Christians that are concerned about religious liberty, the ability to live out, not just believe, but to live out our faith, what happens next? And so we're going to talk about that. I appreciate John. John's favorite statement to me is don't be a biblical bobblehead. And if he hasn't said that yet, I'm sure he will a couple of times during this, but don't be so filled with knowledge that you don't actually go out and do something. And so one of my favorite statements, we'll get into kind of what we can do towards the end. So I'm going to make a few comments here to kind of tee it off. I'm going to pass it off to Steve pretty quickly. I so appreciate Steve. I've been to his church. Steve came up and visited the Capitol with me this past session and just has a real heart for these issues. So John titled this, the Religious Liberty, the Cornerstone of a Free Society. And it looks like I'm going to have to step over here for a second. So I'll speak loudly. Steve, you want to go ahead and give kind of a guiding principle while I'm fixing our technology?
Sure. How many people are here in full-time ministry, just out of curiosity, working with churches, a number of you? And I'm guessing how you have worked through these issues may look different from the others here in this room, and certainly for those who may not share some of the mutual concerns that a group like this would have. But for our church, the guiding principle as it relates to the exercise of religious freedom, and really the exercise of any freedom, any right, the guiding principle is that it must be subjected to the cause of the gospel, okay? And so when it came to this issue of the governor issuing a decree, if you will, to shut down, for groups not to meet, and in the beginning, it was all about flattening the curve. We looked at that, considered that, and thought, don't like the idea of not meeting, but at the same time, there's a love your neighbor ethos at work here. And so to go back to John's analogy, and in analogies, you have to be careful not to stretch them too far, but I kind of think, okay, if the local government came in and said, we need you to get out of that house, not just for your own sake, but there's some people down underneath that if we don't take care of this house and get it fixed, it's going to crumble and land on their heads. And so for their sake, we'd like for you to step out of the house for a while so we can get that fixed with you. That to me kind of frames the approach that we took with regard to COVID. Now, has there been some overreach in some communities? Absolutely. But I also believe, at least in the beginning, here in Indiana, in the southern part, our church wasn't being asked to do anything that other similar-like groups weren't being asked to do, whether it was movie theaters or sport groups, that sort of thing. But I also think we do have to be, while we want to assume the best, we need to be leery of the worst in terms of motives when it comes to this kind of thing. But like I said, just as far as a guiding principle, it can't be all about us. It's what does advance the cause of the gospel the best? Does demanding our rights, or does letting go of our rights? Certainly Jesus let go of a lot of his rights, Philippians 2, in order to serve us. And yet we see in Acts 22 Paul demanding his rights. Again, it wasn't just so Paul could be taken care of, it was so he could advance the gospel. So that's kind of the guiding principle as I think about it, Josh.
That's helpful, Steve. We'll see if we're back here. So as John mentioned, I lead the Daniel Initiative, which is a fairly new effort. We're in about a year of Indiana Family Institute, and it is designed to build relationships between the ministers of God and the ministers of government, Romans 13, in an effort to minister to them, but also to partner with them in seeking the common good. And so I had a lot of great conversations. We met with 52 different legislators this past session, many of those kind of in-office meetings, sharing Scripture, asking that question. What are the tough issues in your particular area? And then how can we partner with you on them? Senator Crane mentioned Senator J.D. Ford. We met with him. And like many things in life, we see some of the same problems, but perhaps have different solutions for those problems. Now, it has been locked down, and I enjoy having a good time. We're going to talk about some heavy stuff, but I've always considered a mark of civic responsibility the fact that I voted. All right, and so you've all seen those I voted stickers. So here's our logo. But then during lockdown, there was another sticker that you could receive that symbolized your civic responsibility, and it was this: I showered. All right, so you can perhaps display that. So this is an episode of the Good Citizen podcast. You can find that on iTunes, wherever you play podcasts. And our focus there is how can we be gospel-centered citizens in post-Christian America? That's an ongoing project. It's a tension that we have to manage. It's not a problem that we solve, but we want to study that and study the people that are actually doing that on a day-to-day basis. So let's jump into religious liberty. This is from Paul Marshall. who is a leader at Baylor University, a political scientist, a Christian. He says, the right to follow our conscience lies at the center of human dignity and is the core of every other human right. The right to be able to practice, not just to believe, but to actually live out your faith, is at the core of human identity and is the foundation for every other right. So I thought that Senator Crane's title for this presentation was so applicable. So let's jump into kind of what is it, just kind of laying that biblical framework. And as I've talked to many pastors as well as elected officials, one thing that I don't see a lot of, even from our churches or in our society, is what I might call a public theology. Many people know the Bible and they know policy or they know the law, but how to apply the Scripture to their work in government is something that hasn't been taught or thought through well. And I'm not slighting anyone. I'm just saying it hasn't been a practice of ours. Now, as a Christian, I believe that I'm called to proclaim and live out the gospel in every area of my life, whether that's at school, at my home, at my church, at my job, but also in my role as citizen. And so that's what we're studying here. So I'll give you what I believe is the foundation of the church's public witness. And it's this very simple truth. All people are created in the image of God. And I think there's kind of 5 pieces to that real quickly. First of all, the life issue, that life should be protected from conception all the way to natural death. The Christian sexual ethic. We promote marriage as an exclusive heterosexual lifelong union between a man and a woman because that is God's good design from creation. It's his created order. We also will support racial unity. The fact that all people, regardless of ethnicity, are created in the image of God and are therefore worthy of dignity and respect. Another one is poverty. I might say the Matthew 25 issues. So poverty, but also hunger, clothing, whether you're an orphan, all of those Matthew 25 issues. And then the 5th one I would mention, as Christians, we support religious liberty for all people, not because we believe that there is no truth, but because we are confident that the gospel is the truth and we follow the way of Jesus. And so this, I believe, is the foundation for the church's public witness. So again, what do you mean by that? Here's a working definition for religious liberty. Certainly you may have a better one, but as I've advocated in court and court of public opinion, this is one that I've kind of landed on. The right to live out one's deeply held convictions without fear of punishment by the government. We take religious liberty for granted here in the United States, but according to a State Department study, 80% of the people alive on the planet right now, not in the past, but right now, have restrictions on their ability to practice their faith. And so this is truly a unique opportunity for Christians in the United States. Christ's teaching, just jump into this for just a little bit. I want to pass it quickly to Steve to get his thoughts on this. So why do we believe in religious liberty? It's really hard to talk about this without getting into the role of church and state, which is kind of like dancing through a minefield. But what did Jesus say? He's asked about paying taxes, and he's handed a coin, a denarius, which was the Roman currency of the day. And he looks at it and he says, we all know this, render therefore unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Well, it's important when you're studying that to know what was he looking at. And so here's the denarius. On the front side of the denarius was the superscription of Caesar, of Tiberius. And what this symbolized was the political power of the Roman state. And as Christians, we're supposed to be good citizens. We see Romans 13, that we're supposed to be following God. And we do so by obeying government. But then on the back of the coin was a superscription of Tiberius's mother, dressed as the goddess of peace, with the insinuation that not only will you obey the Roman state, you will also worship the emperor. And this was the sticking point for Christians, right? Because the emperor was a god king. I heard a cool word recently. He was a sacro monarch, all right, that believed that he was both God and man. One example I give when I speak in churches is the state's often compared to a sword, right? It has the power to punish you. But then the church is compared to a light bulb. Like we fulfill the Great Commission. Well, what do you get when you put a sword and a light together? You get a lightsaber, all right? And I don't know about you, but these are pretty dangerous things, right? And I'm glad I've never had to use one. I'm like in a practice session, and I only lost an arm today, you know. But whenever, and you look back through history, How often has the state said, I'm going to control the church's light. I want to use spiritual authority to coerce people to do what the state wants to do. And then how many times has the church said, I want to use the state's sword to force conversions? And every time that happens, there's disaster. And that's why the American experiment is such a beautiful example of getting it right, where we have the role of the state, we have the role of the church, they're institutionally separate, but the church provides moral guidance and acts as a conscience to our society. So I know I spent a little bit of time talking about this, but before we dive into the more complex issues, I think we need that strong biblical foundation. So I'll pass it back to Pastor Yeaton and then also to John for comments on this.
Sure. Appreciate all those insights. I really think for people of my generation, I'll be 53 next Wednesday, and older, grew up assuming all of these rights, assuming the institutions of our culture leaned favorably towards the church, towards the posture of the church and that sort of thing. And so we've just taken these freedoms for granted. We really haven't had to wrestle with them in thoughtful ways. And now that we see some of those freedoms being challenged, we're not always responding very well, very thoughtfully. Sometimes we're responding, at least from my experience, what I've seen, we're responding like every other special interest group out there, demanding our rights, crying out like victims. We are not victims. We are victors. We belong to a different kingdom. Our identity is not wrapped up in the recognition of our rights in the eyes of the government. Our job is a whole lot easier to advance the gospel and to serve others and to bless others with those freedoms. So we absolutely ought to be at the vanguard of defending our freedoms, of articulating why our freedoms don't just benefit us as Christians, but benefit all people. So when it comes to this issue of religious freedom, I think we will serve our cause better, not by coming at it from the perspective of protecting our own special interests, but why this is important for everybody. So, but that takes a lot of work. Again, we can't assume certain things. We have to think through these things differently. Maybe learn from some of our brothers and sisters in other countries who have never had the benefit of the freedoms that we have, but they've been able to flourish and prosper in their ministries. So maybe we can humble ourselves and learn from those experiences as well. As I mentioned, like I said, the gospel ought to be what frames and shapes our use of these religious freedoms. And I kind of, under that umbrella, put love of neighbor for sure when it came to how we submitted to the stay-at-home restrictions as far as the COVID type stuff. But there's other times you do need to stand up. So, for example, getting back to this idea of how does this benefit others? Why do we need to make this case? They mentioned, John and Jeff mentioned the Bostock case from last week. Okay, so how is that going to impact the church? Well, I think there's an argument to be made. It could impact it in big ways, especially if your churches have schools or preschools or other things. And so, I think it'd be, we might want to make a case. We should be able to hire who we want to hire, and that's it. But and there's a case to be made for that. But I also think we need to think about, okay, how can we make the case in the eyes of our community that our ability to run our program according to our convictions, which is what religious liberty is all about, brings a benefit to this community, because we cannot and we will not hire people that undermine our scriptural convictions. If our refusal to do that means we have to shut down the preschool and not offer this is how it's going to impact the community. We have a number of people who utilize that preschool who may not be able to take advantage of those resources because they don't have the resources to do it. But because of offerings of the church, that sort of thing, we're able to provide scholarships so people of various backgrounds. It's the most diverse group in our church. Columbus, Indiana has a huge Indian population, not huge, but a sizable Hispanic population, a little bit smaller African-American population. All are represented in that preschool in a way that you don't see in the rest of the church, which is something we need to be working on and addressing. But some of those groups and some of those individuals don't have the financial resources to take advantage of a preschool of the quality that we are offering. So you're telling us we can't do this. This is going to hurt other people. I think when you start looking at it from that angle, making that kind of case, even people who aren't in alignment with the church's theology and all that might start considering religious freedoms a little differently. Say, you know what, we do need to let some of these groups live out their faith in a way that they can do so in good conscience. Because if they don't, we are going to lose a lot of benefits. You know, whether it's some of the adoption agencies, so many of them are Christian run by Christian principles, but they feel convicted by Scripture that a child deserves to be raised by a man and a woman. It's a women's right issue. I mean, if it's anything else. And we cannot, in good conscience, put a child in the home of a family of 3 parents who are married, those kinds of arrangements, or 2 same-sex people, whatever else. Cannot do that. And okay, well, then you have to shut it down. Well, what happens? There's a ton of kids who lose out because now one of the agencies that's doing the most to put kids in stable homes has been eliminated because religious freedom has lost out to sexual freedom. And so I think these are cases that we need to make and do it differently, but do it in a way that tries to keep in mind those outside the church. How can we turn not necessarily enemies of the church, but those who may not have a position one way or another? How can we, I think it's a more sizable group, how can we turn them into allies? I think we turn them into allies by making a persuasive case for the benefit that the exercise of religious freedom brings to all people. Now, that's just in relationship to the church. I also think the church has to be very astute, and we haven't been, to be at the forefront of defending religious freedom wherever it's abused, not just when it's Christians who are being abused. And I think that builds credibility as well. So if we see, Muslims in a community not being able to exercise their religious freedom, Christians ought to be leading the way. One, there's a selfish interest, I guess, there, because what happens to them could happen to us as well. But hey, again, this is a human rights issue, all that. We should be at the forefront. And then I think as we do that and do that well, we gain more allies. And people start looking at religious freedom differently. So we can't assume people appreciate it. People don't, especially in today's culture. Sexual freedom is the main freedom of our culture today. And it is bulldozing over, steamrolling over religious freedom, and not to good benefit. So anyway, there's a couple of thoughts there.
Yeah, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast again, Josh, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. I think you both have touched on some really critical issues, and I would just kind of reiterate a couple of things that Pastor Steve has mentioned. As I've often shared with people, if we do not understand and advance a robust Christian worldview, then everybody loses. Well, I say that as somebody who understands the broad-reaching implications of a properly lived out, truly Christian worldview that leads to the truly good life. But to your point, part of that also means we set guardrails, right? It's like any good parent who sets boundaries with their child. Well, we see it work within the context of the basic family unit, but when we start setting guardrails in the form of laws or then law enforcement within the larger society, there's a lot of resistance to that. And so I think we as Christian leaders need to not only understand why we believe what we believe and why it does matter for all people, but then that also puts us in a position to be an advocate in terms of the practical application of some of those critical ideas. I've often said, and I'm a former pastor myself, pastor turned politician. In fact, somebody told me once that if you want to get into politics, just get in the church, because there's plenty of politics in the church. But as a former pastor, one of the questions that I put to our staff one time during a leadership meeting was, if our church ceased to exist in this community, would anybody know, and would anybody care? And that needs to be a fundamental yes if you take your faith and your position in the community seriously as a church. Would anybody know, and would they even care if you cease to exist? Well, hopefully, if we are understanding our Christian worldview and we are living it out in the best way possible, then we are adding good and we are pursuing the common good. and helping people not only understand why it's good, but then beginning to see the tangible benefit. Frankly, if I were going to be honest, I think the church hasn't always done a good job of equipping people to understand those things. You know, like you said, the application of the biblical idea to real life, you know, and Josh, you talked about this theology of kind of this political theology, right? What does my faith have to do with my politics or politics in general? In fact, I'm going to say that politics and faith should be absolutely separate. No. If we understand the implications of politics and we understand the implications of theology and what God intends for government and for politics, then we should hopefully have a consistent understanding of how the Christian worldview impacts all of that. As we said in one of our previous sessions here at the Hoosier Leadership Series, it's not about whether or not we should legislate morality. It's simply whose morality are we going to legislate, because the issues of right and wrong run rampant. And your answer to what's right and good starts first with what do you believe about some of these core things. One last thing I would say to your point about seeking the common good. I was reminded just recently, I was at Barnes & Noble bookstore, and there's a new book out about John Adams and his defending the redcoats, the British soldiers who had been part of the Boston Massacre. And he came under massive fire for that. But he defended them because the basic system was everybody should have their day in court, right? If we believe that, then to your point, then we should be advocating for those basic ideas. If we believe that not only black lives matter, but they matter because all lives matter, then what does that mean for how do we address racial issues and injustice in our community? If we believe that this idea of religious liberty and rights of conscience is a fundamental core value, then do I believe it enough to advocate for my friends and neighbors who may be of a different religious persuasion? Is it that all religious beliefs matter because religion matters, or is it just some matter and some don't? Now, to your point, in the free market of ideas, I firmly believe that if you follow the evidence where it leads and you take a look at the Christian worldview, it will more than hold its own in the marketplace of ideas. I think it will prevail for any number of reasons. But I think sometimes we play scared. You know, like if I advocate for you, then people think I'm selling out or something like that, as opposed to what you said so well, and that is actually we build credibility by being a universal advocate for some of these values.
I want to say something to what John just said, a couple of things. One, this idea that the church ought to be engaged in the political realm in some way is an idea that, again, for ministers of my generation, at least in evangelical churches, like, no way, you don't do that. And there's been some good reasons why not to, because there have been a lot of times when the church has tried to engage in the political realm that it's done so very poorly. I remember actually coming up here to the State House in favor of RFRA. And there was, of course, a big RFRA rally, the religious freedom issue that was going on at the time. And I was in favor because I thought it blessed everybody. You know, I thought it was good for everybody, even though it wasn't framed that way in the media, unfortunately. But when I saw some of the behavior of those who I was in agreement with and how some of their slogans and some of the things they were saying about others, it's like I was embarrassed. You know, it's like, this is why churches don't want to be involved with this, because it hurts our credibility. We're not doing this well. Not all, but just some who were there were doing it in a very, you know, there's just an attitude of self-righteousness and condemnation and almost hatred for those who didn't share these values. And that's a problem we have to address. But I also think a bigger reason why this is such a tough sell in the church is because that's not how many of us have done church for decades. We really have embraced, to a large degree, the consumer model. What do you have for me? What's going to entertain me? What's going to help me as a parent, help me in my finances and all that? And there is some value to some of those things. I'm painting with a broad brush, I know.
As opposed to what do we have for the world?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so to try to pivot and say, if you're going to be a part of this ministry, we are going to equip you. You are going into training, and you are going to be sent out. And that's a whole different kind of perspective, a whole different kind of approach to discipleship. Isn't just so you can have some verses to give you peace in the middle of a dark night. While there is that element as well, there's more to it. We really do believe in loving our neighbor. But
It's interesting you say that about the RFRA debate, right? Because in the legislature, we have all kinds of debates. And I can look out in the hallway and I can see people who are basically with me philosophically, but who do not represent me thoughtfully in the way that it's being argued, right? And I think back to C.S. Lewis's famous quote, "You've never met a mere mortal," right? That every person we interact with is of infinite value because we're made in the image of God, which means, yes, we can advocate for our position, whatever it is, but not at the expense of denigrating somebody else who is of equal value in the eyes of God as I am, right? And we aren't always as thoughtful in terms of how we advance our issue because we're more concerned about the truth, or maybe we're scared, and we want to kind of win.
I think we have a incredible opportunity right now to do just that. And I'll share something real quick before I give it back to Josh. But I was just sharing with Eric Bingaman, a friend of mine who's part of your program here, before it came up here, that we the culture has long accused the church of being very judgmental and all that. Well, the church doesn't hold a candle to the judgmentalism we see on display in our culture right now to anybody who doesn't adhere to current political correct thought, okay? I mean, your whole life's career can be destroyed because of something you did 20, 30 years ago. We're seeing that all over the place, whether it's in sports, entertainment, politics, all over the place. And it's fascinating. We used to be a country that prided itself on second chances and that sort of thing. I don't know that we as a country can say that anymore. But who can say that? The church. The church can say that. We preach forgiveness. We preach in a Christ who does not hold your past, who says you don't have to be defined by your past. Your identity is in who Christ is and what he offers. We believe in restoration. You can be a part of this family. You can be restored. We ought to be preaching that message. And also, in terms of seeing the value of everybody, the church should be leading the way. We can see the value in those that we disagree with, who represent what we don't stand for. And let me give you a small example. You just mentioned the Boston Massacre. But this, in a more recent, and maybe you saw this in the news, in one of the protests that some rioters obviously did some horrible things in Louisville. Maybe you saw the incident involving a man by the name of Darren Lee Jr. He's a daycare owner. He was protesting the injustice of what happened to George Floyd. He's a black man, and certainly, hey, this is wrong. And he was out on the streets protesting what had happened, and abuse and police departments and such. That's what he was there for. But there was a white police officer who had gotten separated from his squad. I don't know what you call it in law enforcement, his team or whatever, other fellow police officer. He was by himself. And it was not looking good for this police officer. Some of the protesters who were turning violent had him in their crosshairs, and they were kind of converging on him. And Darren Lee Jr. saw what was going on and immediately kind of stepped in front of this officer, and then some others kind of came around. They all locked arms and encircled him and defended this police officer, and then they became the target of abuse. Why are you standing over this guy? He represents the problem, all that kind of stuff, Well, as I'm working on my sermon for this next Sunday, and I shared this a little bit with Josh, looking at the story of Hagar and Abram and Sarai, and Abram and Sarai really mistreated Hagar, and she runs off. And we see God's tenderness for the marginalized, and he goes out to take care of Hagar. That's overt grace. We see some compassion there. The covert grace I see in that story is that God doesn't cancel Abram and Sarai. He still continues to work through them. God shows grace to the oppressed, yes, but also to the oppressor. All right? So as I'm thinking all that's in my head, I'm thinking about this recent event in the news. I thought, I just wonder. And so I tracked Darren Lee Jr. down through Facebook, and it was kind of hard because the news spells his name Ian. His name is actually Ian and Darren. And just another instance that the news doesn't always get its details right. But I think getting a man's name right wouldn't be that difficult. But anyway, I tracked him down. I private messaged him, and I said, "Hey, just want to commend you for that act of bravery and seeing that man's humanity and what you did and all that. I'm curious, what role did your faith play in the actions you took that night? Not suggesting that only Christ followers can do good things. I don't believe that." But Christ followers absolutely should do this kind of thing all the time, hands down, And he wrote back a very generous response. He said, "As a matter of fact, I am a Christian." And that did go into play in the actions he took that night. And so while you have groups out there on all sides who have completely demonized those who don't agree, Christians should not be among those people. And so here's a Christian who saw an injustice against George Floyd and felt that he needed to be a part of something that brought attention to that. So he protested, At the same time, he did not disregard the humanity of this white police officer who maybe in his mind embodies, the problem, police force and all that. But no, this man deserves to be protected and such. And he did that, even though it brought criticism upon himself by the very ones he was marching with, I think that reflects the grace the church ought to be on display in the church all the time. And we haven't always done that because sometimes we take our lead from what the culture is doing. We fight our battles like the culture fights its battles. No, we do not fight the way the world fights. Our approach is different. In fact, the things that we fight, principles, we may fight against certain principles, but we always love those who hold those principles. And so anyway.
That's an excellent story, and I think it's such a great word for the church. And our society has some very intractable problems where our secular ideologies have shown themselves to be bankrupt, and I think the gospel can show itself strong in these instances. So to kind of summarize what it is, I'll say Jesus said, render to Caesar that which is Caesar's. Who's Caesar in the American context? We are, the people. We hold the ultimate authority. And it is not Caesar's role to dictate someone's ultimate allegiance. And therefore, you have kind of three options. What is religious liberty? One, is it Christian favoritism? Where I certainly believe that our country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. But does that mean that Christian institutions are held up above others? I'd argue no. The second option is secularism. Are Christian ideas completely scrubbed from public life? I'd argue no. So there's a third way, and that is what Professor John Inazu calls a confident pluralism. When you hear the word pluralism, don't hear relativism. He's not saying there's no truth. He's saying there is truth, but because we have the truth, we should act confidently in our society. And coming back to what Pastor Yeaton said at the very beginning, why? Why would that be? And there may be those that disagree with that particular take on religious liberty. Why would that be the case? And I keep trying to come back to the gospel. This is a famous verse, 1 Timothy 2, 1 and 2. Exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority. And we have Pam and Tim in the group this year that are part of Public Servants Prayer. Tim arranged a prayer service for leaders in Indianapolis that I tell you was so powerful. It was just amazing. Charles Ware, if you haven't heard him pray, no, there were lots of great presentations, but that was amazing. And so I'm so grateful for the work of Public Servants Prayer. But why do we pray for public officials? The verse goes on to say that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. So why do we pray for our officials? So that we would have the freedom, the ability to pursue our Christian lives and to fulfill the Great Commission. But why do we want the peace to be able to do that? The verse 3 says, for this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who will have all men to be saved and to come unto the knowledge of the truth. Why do we as Christians want a society where all people are respected, where religious freedom is honored? So we have an open marketplace of ideas to present the truth to our society. That's what religious liberty is, and that's why I think every Christian should be engaged in defending it. So unless you guys have something else to add, we're going to jump into the more recent events. Where are we? Where is it in a sense? So as we jump into this, here's just a quick idea. As I talk about religious freedom, I often use these three bubbles. James Madison said that rights are parchment barriers, not like a concrete barrier that can be torn. A friend of mine named Brian Bowman shared this verse. I thought it was just so helpful. When I think of American jurisprudence, there are kind of three religious liberty bubbles, the outermost being the marketplace. The second one being independent Christian nonprofits like board-run schools. And then the most protected institution is the church. And I've given you a kind of a quote there to support that. What's happened recently, this was a case from 2013 where a photographer was not allowed to decline photographing same-sex weddings due to a deeply held religious belief. And the New Mexico Supreme Court said, I would say to the photographers, with the utmost respect, it is the price of citizenship that you have to jeopardize those deeply held religious beliefs to participate in the market. Shivering words has certainly sent a shiver down my spine. And so you can see how the kind of the marketplace bubble is perforated. And the Bostock decision also, which we'll talk about in a minute, probably pops it, to use an analogy. All right, so next you have independent board-run institutions, like perhaps the Little Sisters of the Poor, who were back at the Supreme Court this year saying they don't want to have to provide abortion-inducing drugs to their employees. These are nuns that serve the poor, and they've had to go to the Supreme Court twice. So we can see where that bubble, I think, is also perforated a bit. Now, I would argue that the church is still very protected in American law. The Masterpiece Cake Shop case said that churches could not be forced to perform marriages or other ceremonies that would conflict with their statement of faith. But, and I think John may say this, the ability to just practice your faith in like the 1 square yard behind the pulpit is really no freedom at all. If you're not free to practice your faith in your life and in the way you impact society, you're really not free. So I'll pass it over.
Well,
here.
and just to that point, there was a recent, I say recent, probably within the last 5 years, press release from a mayor here in Indiana. And essentially, if you were going to summarize their position, it was in regard to a civil discrimination issue. If you were to summarize the message in that press release, we're not saying you can't practice your faith. You absolutely can, in your hearts and in your home. And that is exactly, to your point, Josh, where we are heading on this whole religious liberty front. So don't fall prey to this idea of, oh, I guess we still can practice our faith, because the implication being, yes, but it's going to be cloistered within your heart and within your home, which, as we know, and back to this idea of worldview, if I'm understanding that my faith is not just about religion as a segment of the rest of my life, but it's actually a worldview that permeates, then that means I can't, by definition, keep it limited just to my heart and just to my home. It has to be lived out beyond that.
Amen. So let's jump into some of the current controversies. Here's just a picture of a parking lot. Quick primer on the free exercise clause as it relates to this issue. I would argue that per the Constitution, the government does not have the authority to tell churches they can't meet. But I will just reflect on what is the current case law. Coming from a case called Smith back in the 90s, actually written by Scalia. Justice Scalia was a conservative justice, but basically said government can limit religious activity as long as it has a very strong, what we call a compelling interest, a very, very strong interest, and if its actions are narrowly tailored to accomplish that purpose. So in the analysis, what's a compelling interest? And I'm fairly certain if you look that up in legal dictionaries in the future, a global pandemic might be a compelling interest, all right? But then government does have the responsibility when it's trying to protect people from the virus to do so in a very narrowly tailored way, respecting religious exercise. And this was the issue that came up here, because if you remember, people could drive through Wendy's and McDonald's and go sit in Walmart parking lot all they wanted, but we weren't free to actually go park at a church 9 feet apart, parking spot space, and listen to a preacher. And I wrote a good bit on this. I had an article entitled, Should Churches Draw the Line at Parking Lot Services or Drive-In Services? And I think absolutely yes, because other similar entities were being treated more favorably than churches. And you probably followed the case in Louisville where people attending a drive-in service had their license plates taken down and were basically ordered into quarantine. I saw this meme, if you're familiar with the Shawshank Redemption. What are you in for? I went to church in the parking lot, all right? So the story behind this was I had a number of pastors contacting me saying, hey, this is ridiculous. We want to just have a parking lot service. But you had local health officials saying you can't do that. And so I go talk to the local health official, and they're like, well, I've got the CDC telling me one thing, and I've got the governor telling me something else. And you have to understand, local health officials don't get a sticker for opening things back up. They get a sticker for keeping everybody safe. And so I was grateful that Governor Holcomb did issue, he made an announcement and said that drive-in services were allowed. Now, many churches were very uncomfortable with the language, saying that you can only open if you do this. I am thankful for Governor Holcomb's orders, and I think as time went on, his language became more precise. And like church leaders, a lot of church leaders will say, look, I'm leading through my first pandemic, all right? There wasn't like Pandemic 101 in seminary. Mm-hmm. And the same is true for governing officials. So I was willing to extend some grace, and I was grateful for this announcement that allowed them to open up. So that's the parking lot issue. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
Well, I think one of the issues that came up for me in this whole thing, because obviously as a state senator, I had a lot of constituents that were reaching out on this, and I finally had my legislative assistant start keeping 2 files. The one file was, how dare they shut everything down? And the other file was, how dare they open everything back up? Because you're in the middle trying to figure this out. And so one of the things that I was trying to help people understand is exactly what you talked about. And that is, should we responsibly take into consideration the motivation behind whatever the government's trying to do, right? Is there, as you said, that compelling interest? And we have to, right? The government is in place for a reason. Of course, where we get into the muck is everybody's making their own definition of what constitutes a compelling interest versus not and all that. But the government does have a role there, and motivation matters. Versus, any government action is automatic government overreach. I think that's an unfair assessment of government. Sadly, we've seen that happen too many times where government has overreached, so we have kind of this tendency to assume the worst rather than believing that there is a positive good that comes out of government.
And so my basic position on this was to see government trying to protect people from a pandemic. You can look back to 1918 and how the churches in D.C. reacted to these types of shutdown orders. They complied for a while, but then as the numbers started to go down, they said, hey, we're not going to comply any longer. So I thought there was some good historical precedent on kind of how do we practice this, how do we practice our faith during a pandemic.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. I think as we kept in perspective the gospel of love your neighbor, that's why we submitted to some of these restrictions and such. But as John just said, or Josh, there is some overreach, and so the church can't be a pushover. All right, shouldn't be. Again, does it hurt our cause if we stand up and say, hey, we want to have services in the parking lot? Will people think we don't care about the pandemic? I think we got to give people some credit that they can see when something is unfair. They see the difference between fair and unfair. If they see the church or a group being treated differently from other groups, well, hey, that's not fair. I don't care if I go to church or not. That's not fair. I can see why they would stand up for that. That makes sense. That doesn't hurt our cause at all. So I think we need to be careful of that. Again, we're fighting. You talk about 2 files. We're fighting I shouldn't say fighting, but wrestling with these same issues in the church. We reopened our services this past Sunday. Over the weekend, or the days leading up to the service, I got an email from somebody saying they would not come because the measures we were taking were not going far enough to guarantee safety. I will not be there Sunday. And I get a text from somebody else, I will not be there because you are encouraging people to wear masks, And so you got people all over the spectrum. It's like, okay, don't come. It's all right. We love you. And so anyway, it's everywhere.
A quick little story on that. So one of my constituents, an older lady, and she and her husband hadn't been out of the house in weeks and probably still haven't been out of the house. So she reached out to my office and basically was very concerned the few times that they had to go out for a doctor's appointment. They see way too much social interaction. And she was pretty good humored, but I said, basically, you think the government hasn't gone far enough and the governor should be having tanks roll down Rockville Road right through our community. She laughed and said, yeah, that's about right. So you have some people, as you said, who are totally one side, people who are totally on the other, and then leaders are in the middle trying to sort it all out.
That's excellent. So when people ask me what kind of experience I have with politics, I tell them I've been in church leadership for 10 years. What else do you need to know?
Exactly.
So moving on to the actual shutdown of in-person services, and I was working with churches all the way from Connecticut to Washington State, and here in Indiana, I was very grateful for Governor Holcomb actually putting churches in front of other venues. And the religious liberty fight that came out of this was really what secular venue should the church be compared to? And there were cases, say, out of the Sixth Circuit in Kentucky that said if people can go to Menards or to a grocery store, then you should be able to meet for church. A church is responsible for being able to do that. There was another string of cases, and my last count was that the cases that went against the churches were slightly higher than those that went for churches, was that no, churches are more like a theater or some sort of actual public assembly. And there was a case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the court didn't reach a final decision. It was just a decision on what's called an injunction. The church asked for the court to stop California from keeping them from meeting. And Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion saying that no, churches are more like a public assembly. Kavanaugh wrote the dissent saying no, churches should have been able to meet. They're more like other public events or public venues. You know, if you can go shop and stay away from people, churches are responsible too. So that was a very difficult episode. There were a lot of different opinions on that issue. That's kind of where it landed. There was one last issue here in Indianapolis because the city of Indianapolis had a different rule than the state. And the city of Indianapolis put a hard cap on churches at 25, but allowed malls to open at 50%. And a church challenged that. Eventually they backed down. And again, I appreciate Mayor Hogsett trying to keep people safe. This is one of those difficult issues to navigate. I'm glad that he just simply opened it up and allowed churches to meet at the same rate. So those are some of the updates. This has been really difficult in other places around the country where churches still are not able to meet, and so those cases are ongoing. I wanted to mention just briefly, as we wrap up, the Bostock case, which came out last week. And if you followed it, this opinion was written by Justice Gorsuch. And the question was whether or not Title VII, which Title VII of the Civil Rights Act deals with discrimination in employment, was whether or not the word sex, which was written into the Civil Rights Act in 1964. You may not discriminate based on sex. You couldn't hire or fire somebody just because they were a woman. Whether that word included, in its definition, sexual orientation and gender identity. Justice Gorsuch said, yes, it does. Now, there are many opinions about this. Justice Gorsuch, I thought, was more of a textualist or originalist. There's no way that Congress in 1964, for even those that were for this type of language being added to non-discrimination laws, that Congress in 1964 even understood the category of gender identity. But he went ahead and said, look, these decisions involve sex in some way, and so we're going to kind of say sex in parentheses, including sexual orientation and gender identity, close parentheses. This was different than the 22 states that have acted on state law. They've always treated this as a different category. I think the most important part for Christians is there's a big question now. All right, if you may not choose who you hire and fire based on these characteristics, what about ministries that hold to the Christian sexual ethic? And that say, because of God's, again, created order, we believe that that's good for us and best for everyone, we're only going to select employees that teach this and live according to that statement of faith. What's going to happen? Well, Justice Gorsuch gave us a great assurance. He said that'll be worked out in future litigation. So he just redefined a word. And he's like, oh, don't worry, guys. We'll work it out later. And I was mentioning to Ryan McCann, our executive director, the fact that I'm sitting at a computer on Monday morning waiting for an opinion by like 5 justices on this incredibly contentious social issue is probably not healthy for our republic. But my thought is that perhaps what's going to happen is the Supreme Court's going to land on what we call the Utah Compromise, where those that identify as LGBTQ would have protections in the marketplace, but they will probably come back with another case and strongly support the ministerial exception, which allows churches and Christian nonprofits, religious nonprofits, to say we only hire and fire those, we hire and fire based upon the fact that you agree with our statement of faith. Now, again, that may not be the case, but that's kind of my best guess at where this is going. So I'll pass it on to these guys for any thoughts.
There's a great editorial in the Wall Street Journal today just about that very case. I'd recommend you check it out. I said a few moments ago that we used to be able, like I said, people of my generation, older, grew up with the safe assumption that the institution of culture leaned in favor of the convictions of the church. Okay, we can't assume that anymore. I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we did. But here's another thing: we can't assume that people in the church hold those convictions, even in strong, historically Bible-believing, conservative evangelical churches. You just can't assume that. You can't assume that they're obtaining it through osmosis at all, just because maybe we mention it a few times a year in a sermon. They are so bombarded, especially our younger people, through popular media with agenda-driven shows that really counter the biblical sexual ethic. And they've been doing that for decades. I mean, certainly when I grew up in the 70s and 80s, it was not uncommon to see a unmarried man and woman go to bed together. You were kind of surprised if they didn't at some point, okay? That should have been jarring enough. It wasn't, sadly. You know, when they seemed to get upset when other kinds of relationships came into play. But the reality is we're at this point now where people in the church don't adhere to a biblical sexual ethic. Maybe they do in practice, but in philosophy. And let me give you just a small example, and John knows this story, but when I moved to Columbus, and just I hadn't been there very long, but in a sermon, I had just a minor subpoint to another point. It was just a minor illustration. The point had to do with religious liberty. Basically, the point is that we don't want the government to tell us what to do. Christians should be able to decide for themselves whether they're going to do, X, Y, or Z. Okay, so, and I mentioned we've all heard stories about photographers and bakers and all that who have been told they must do this and can't do this. And so I wasn't coming down on what a Christian baker should do, because I think two Christian bakers of a like faith, of a like regard for Scripture, could reach different conclusions. One Christian baker could say, you know what, I am not going to make that cake because I see that as an endorsement of a relationship that I think is unbiblical, and I cannot do that in good conscience. Another Christian, again, like faith, like commitment to Scripture, could reach a different conclusion. Say, I'm going to make that cake not because I believe in this union, but because I want to build a bridge. I want to get my foot in the door. I want to be able to share Christ with them later, whatever else. Christians can disagree about those kinds of conclusions. My point in that subpoint in this minor illustration was just to say it shouldn't be the government telling Christians what conclusions they can make. Christians ought to have the freedom to work that out for themselves. That was it. It was, and I didn't even say that much, but it was a very minor point, just to set up a bigger point. I got chased down by a younger lady after church. Are you telling me that Jesus would not make a cake for a gay wedding? And I said, actually, that really wasn't my point. And she said, I think Jesus would make the biggest, best wedding cake ever for a gay wedding. And of course, I'm thinking in my head, well, that'd be really bad business if he makes a better cake for one group as opposed to another group. But I didn't say that out loud. And oftentimes I do say what I'm thinking out loud, but I didn't. And so she came to my office, followed me into my office. I tried to make the point that wasn't my point. Christians can disagree. It just shouldn't be the government. That was my point. And at a certain point with some people, you just figure, you know what, there's no point in talking, so just listen. And she was gone. She didn't come back. But it wasn't just her and her husband. It was 3 other families in the church that left over that. Now, it really rattled me. And I talked to my leadership. I talked to some other people in the church. What did you hear when I made this point? Did the point I was trying, because I know as a communicator, sometimes what you're trying to communicate isn't always what comes across. And to a person, no, we heard what you were saying, and that's what you were communicating, but you have to understand the situation with this individual or whatever else, And so it was just one of those kinds of moments where it's like, I can't take for granted. I can't assume that the people in the pew, and these weren't just people who were checking out the church. These were people who'd been a part of the church, one, a long time, a second generation member there. But you can't assume that they hold to these convictions. So we have to do a lot of teaching. And how we do that, because I think sometimes the church has gotten it wrong, and how we have taught on those issues. It has come across as unloving toward those who are living out those lifestyles or whatever, and that's not good either. But we do need to teach what the Bible has to say. We do need to show why this is best for people, what these convictions are, and all that kind of stuff. We got a work cut out for us for sure.
Yeah.
So I'd lots to say on that issue. I'd like to kind of transition now to Q&A, and I'll just give you kind of one sum of kind of all of our thoughts on this. What's next? I often say this, the best way to defend religious freedom is to use it. And so I believe that this is an important issue for Christians. As we move into the future, we've been fighting, in a sense, a culture war for about 40 or 50 years. Litigation, I'll tell you, a lot of my colleagues, I work closely with Alliance Defending Freedom, the Focus on the Family affiliated policy groups, their heads are spinning after this Bostock case. What does it mean for the future? So there's a lot of uncertainty here, but I'm confident that God is in control, and that's not just kind of an empty saying. But what can we do? If we're not attorneys, if we're not even in a lawmaker position, what can we do? Well, we can live out the gospel in our own context. And we can, as Steve was talking about, show your community why the gospel is best, not just for those that are Christians, but for everyone in our community. And then when we come back and make an argument that, look, you should respect religious freedom, it doesn't come off as another interest group just asking for their rights. It's like, no, we actually care for this society. This is one of the reasons we started the Daniel Initiative, that without relationships with those in authority, it's very easy for them to just kind of put us in a little box over here. And so we want to actually use our religious freedom, and I think it's the best way to defend it. So at this juncture, will anybody have a question? This will be recorded, but we have lots of different conversations on this podcast, so feel free to ask those. What we'll do is if you have a question, state it, I'll restate it, and then I'll ask these gentlemen to answer it. Any questions? Yes, over here. So the question was, what about Trump's reversal of the Johnson Amendment? Has that encouraged pastors or changed their perspective in speaking from the pulpit? For those that aren't familiar with the Johnson Amendment, that prescribed pastors or prohibited them from saying vote for or vote against a particular candidate. So has that affected us at all?
Be honest with you, I'm embarrassed to admit, I didn't know that he had reversed it, be honest with you. However, early in my ministry, yes, it was like, oh, he can't endorse because, you kind of, okay. But in recent years, it's my understanding that there haven't been any convictions anyway of ministers advocating for a certain candidate and such. I think there are other reasons maybe why some choose to endorse or not endorse from the pulpit. But I don't know that that's, I think some of us in ministry have used things like that as a shield from taking some hard positions, and I don't think it's very helpful. But I also can appreciate the wisdom in being careful not to endorse one over another. I think I prefer, my approach is to be strong on positions and then let people make their own decisions. I mean, if whether it's pro-life or biblical sexual ethic or even issues related to economics in terms of what allows people to prosper and such, I think people can figure out which candidates promote those things and which ones don't, because ultimately I want to evangelize. We have enough walls already between the lost and the gospel. I don't need to create more unnecessarily, and so I'm really careful about that. But as far as the Johnson Amendment limiting what I said, it wasn't a concern in my mind, and especially when I discovered that nobody's ever been charged or convicted on that. Or it may be charged, but never convicted, as far as I understand it.
Have their tax exempt.
Yeah, right. Removed.
Tax exemption
right.
revoked.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I think to your point, Stephen, it kind of talks about back to what we were talking about earlier, the kind of the political theology. I don't worry as much about whether or not a pastor is going to endorse a particular candidate. I've been in church settings where it runs the range, right? They're not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Other people take the position you take, which is kind of here's some of the key issues that we care about as the church, and you decide for yourself as an informed voter. And I've also been in other situations where I've been invited up as a candidate, and the pastor says essentially, I'm going to take off my pastor hat now and tell you that I will be voting for, And so it was all around that same idea about the Johnson Amendment. I don't care as much about that as I do about this idea of really developing a robust theology that informs our political life. We absolutely are falling short on that. And so we'll go in. I have people who are in the booth, and this happens every time, my wife and I. They are in the ballot box and they're texting me. I'm not kidding. Like, who should I vote for? It's like, well, I'll try to help you, but a little too late there. And I'm not just talking about, who are the candidates, and it's hard to keep up with, but I'm talking about even some of these bigger issues. When we say a biblical Christian ethic, a sexual ethic, what do we mean by that? And people, oh yeah, I know what you mean. Do we? Do we understand what we mean by that? Do we understand that against the backdrop of the culture, against the backdrop of some of these legal decisions and so forth? So that's where I would love to see pastors and churches really get serious about helping people develop a robust political theology.
So we have time for maybe one or two more questions, if anyone has one.
We have a question.
One last question. Yeah.
I know a lot of churches are hesitant to endorse because of their nonprofit status. I guess from a legal standpoint, are nonprofits supposed to stay away from endorsing? I mean, what implications do they, as a nonprofit, are they supposed to abide by?
So the question is whether or not federally recognized nonprofits should endorse candidates, or what are the implications of doing so, both legal and perhaps somewhat cultural as well. I mean, the Johnson Amendment, which was mentioned earlier, was passed because Johnson was mad at religious groups. And so he tied tax exemption to not saying anything about politics. Logically, there's really not much of a connection there, but that's what got passed into law. And so currently, if you are a charity, you may not say vote for or vote against. Now, that does not extend to talking about issues, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. But if you do want to do advocacy, the more traditional route is to start what's called a 501c4 rather than a C3, or a political action committee, and then there are no concerns. So really, when you set out and you want to start a new effort, generally the question I would ask as an attorney is, what do you want to do? And if you want to say, vote for this candidate, vote against that candidate, the best way to do it is form a social issue organization, or most specifically, a political action committee. Any other thoughts? All right, well, I told John and Steve that they would have an opportunity to give a final thought. So, any final thoughts about religious liberty?
Support it.
That guy's ready for the campaign trail. To elaborate a little further, it goes back to that big question I just posed. What kind of world do we want to live in? And that's where I am so thankful for our founding fathers who had the foresight and the philosophical conviction to set up the framework. So theoretically, it's still in our DNA, but it goes back to some of the conversation we've had here even earlier today about the clash of worldviews. The thing I will tell you is don't buy into this misconception of, oh, they won't be threatened, or pastors will never be threatened because the church is kind of its own separate category. I've heard that so many times, and as Josh pointed out in those 3 different concentric circles, it's just a matter of time because those who have a different worldview than I do are relentless, and there's a lesson to be learned there. How strongly do I believe in the things that I say I believe in? Do I believe in them strongly enough to actually publicly advocate for the common good? Because I can tell you that those who have a different worldview than I do will not stop. And I would say from their vantage point, they shouldn't stop, right? If they believe in what they believe in, they should continue to advocate. But so should we. And if we believe that the Christian worldview and this, we talked about this kind of theology of politics and some of those things, and religious liberty, if we believe that that is true and best for all people ultimately, then we have to understand why, so that then we can be thoughtful spokesmen and women to advocate that. But we also then, back to the point that was made in an earlier discussion, we need to be willing to guard against the encroachment of belief systems and the application of those beliefs that ultimately undermine civil society. And we see this because if people are left to their own devices, you're going to see what we're seeing in cities all across this country. It descends into the lowest common denominator, which is anarchy. And anarchy is not good for anybody. And so we need to be on the absolute forefront, because doing nothing is not an option.
Amen. Well said.
On that. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to mention Daniel Initiative. If you are a pastor, or if you think that your pastor would be interested in coming down, meeting with your legislators, again, we're trying to engage government in God's way. We're trying to do it a little bit differently than we have in the past. I would certainly welcome an opportunity to speak to you or to your pastor about that opportunity. I did bring a couple of resources. I always try to just give some further reading. And like the question back here from this gentleman, there's a lot of hard questions that we're going to have to wrestle through, especially as we become more post-Christian, it appears, in the future. So a couple books, Free to Believe by Luke Goodrich, who has successfully litigated at the Supreme Court several times, from the Beckett Fund. Free to Believe, The Battle Over Religious Liberty in America. So if you want to dive deep into what we've talked about this morning, it's very accessible as well. You might think reading a book from an attorney, oh boy, but it's very accessible. Another one is Letters to an American Christian from Bruce Riley Ashford, who's a professor at a Southern Baptist seminary. This is written as letters to kind of a young Christian wrestling through questions of public theology. Again, I think very accessible, even for people that you're discipling, and trying to help them think through some of these tough issues. Another great one is The Dignity Revolution by Daniel Darling. I mentioned at the beginning that the foundation of the church is public witness, is the fact that we're all created in the image of God. He applies this to every hot button issue of the day. So some great reading there as well. I also do have two resources. One is the Bold Church Strategy. I looked at churches around the country that are making a difference, that have been recognized not by the church, but by their city. They're saying, look, this church has made a difference, and we kind of reverse engineered their strategy. And then also the resource that John mentioned. And I do talk some about the Christian sexual ethic and how we can try to change that messaging from, aren't you just a bunch of bigots and haters, to, no, this is good not just for us, but for all people. So I do have some copies of those available. If you'd like to have one, I'll give it to you. So thanks, gentlemen, for this conversation. I appreciate all that you do.
Thank you, Josh.
It was great to be with you.